We'll always begin with our study of the Iliad and the Odyssey. We will literally ask what happens in book 1 of the Aeneid that will also happen in the Iliad and the Odyssey, book 1 or elsewhere. In fact, we'll play that game here in a few moments when we look at the opening lines of the Aeneid. Okay. Finally, at 3b, our quest to own, as we say, own this material. In other words, how can I make this stuff mine? How can I relate it to my own life personally? And I hope that through our study of the Iliad and the Odyssey already you've been able to do that. Okay. So with that in mind, let's look now at the opening lines of the 3 poems. The Iliad first, the Odyssey next, and finally the Aeneid. The invocation of the Muse, as we look at it for the Iliad and the Odyssey, and sometimes what scholars will call of the Aeneid, the proem, that is to say the opening lines, that ultimately do look very much like an invocation as well. These lines of Iliad 1 should sound familiar. Rage, goddess. Again, we're always working with Fagel's translation of all 3 of these texts, just simply because I think that his translation is the most accessible for us as AP students. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus, his son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighter souls, but made their bodies carry on feasts for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Begin, Muse, again this invocation of the Muse. When the 2 first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles, what god drove them to fight with such a fury? Apollo, the son of Zeus and Leto. Incensed at the king, he swept a fatal plague through the army. Men were dying, and all because Agamemnon spurred Apollo's priest. The opening lines. And of course, as we've lectured those lines, we know so many things going on there in terms of setting up the study. Of course, this should also sound now familiar to you. Book 1 opening lines, Odyssey. Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course. Once he plundered the hollow heights of Troy. Many cities of many saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heart sick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all, the blind fools. They devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped from sight the day of their return. Launch out on his story, Muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time too. By now, all the survivors who had avoided headlong death were safe at home, escaped the wars and waves. But one man alone, his heart set on his wife and his return. Calypso, the bewitching nymph, the lustrous goddess, held him back deep in her arching caverns, craving him for a husband. But then, when the wheeling seasons brought the year round, that year spun out by the gods, when he should reach his home, Ithaca, though not even there would he be free of trials, even among his loved ones. Even then every god took pity, all except Poseidon. He raged on, seething against the great Odysseus, till he reached his native land. Now, of course, one of the fun things about having studied so closely the Iliad and the Odyssey is that as we read this, I'm smiling, you're smiling, because there just so much is said there, can we say this out loud, that you only appreciate after you finish reading the poem closely. Yes? You can't appreciate it from just reading plot summary. You have to experience the language on your own. Well, if that's the Iliad and the Odyssey, let's listen now to the opening lines of Virgil. Wars and a man, I sing, an exile, driven on by fate. He was the first to flee the coast of Troy, destined to reach Lavinian shores and Italian soil. Yet many blows he took on land and sea from the gods above, thanks to cruel Juno's relentless rage. And many losses he bore in battle too, before he could found a city, bring his gods to Latium, source of the Latin race, the Alban lords and the high walls of Rome. Tell me, Muse, how it all began. Why was Juno outraged? What could wound the queen of the gods with all her power? Why did she force a man so famous for his devotion to brave such rounds of hardship, bear such trials? Can such rage inflame the immortals' hearts? And then it begins. There was an ancient city, and of course, we're talking Carthage right away. Let's pay attention to just already some of the similarities. Wars will immediately make us think of Achilles and the Iliad. A man will make us immediately think of Odysseus and the Odyssey. The fact that we're singing will obviously remind us that Achilles was singing in Iliad 9 when Odysseus came to offer him all of that time so he could get his Kleos, and he was singing about warriors. Odysseus and the Odyssey celebrates the poet and the poem and the singing. And of course, here we are again, singing. Virgil will tell us, I want to sing you a song. About what? An exile. The fugitive. Notice how many times in both the Iliad and the Odyssey the notion of the fugitive is played out, especially at the end of the Odyssey as Odysseus is spinning his stories. Always seems that a fugitive is involved. Virgil is going to play that game. He's driven on, this fugitive, by what? Fate. So we're back to this notion of who's to blame and the whole notion of destiny and the gods versus fate. He was the first to flee the coast of Troy, although we're going to have others that escaped as well we'll learn about. He was destined to reach Lavinian shores, Italy, and Italian soil. It's interesting that soil gets mentioned here because Italian soil is something that Virgil loved to celebrate in some of his other poems. Great for growing things. Yet we're told many blows Aeneas took on land and sea from the gods above. By the way, let's point out, while I mentioned his name, Aeneas, notice that his name is not actually mentioned in these opening lines, right? He says, many blows from the gods above, thanks to cruel Juno's relentless rage, the very word that gets used at the beginning of the Iliad itself. And many losses he bore, sounding very much like the invocation of the muse in the Iliad, in battle too, before he could found a city, bring his gods to Latium. In other words, the gods are brought out of the city of Troy and they're transported to Italy, source of the Latin race. Let's just pause and point out, this is going to be a poem about three things. It's going to be a poem about a man, Aeneas. It's going to be a poem about a city, Rome. It's going to be a poem, most importantly, I think, for Virgil, it's going to be a poem about a people, the great Roman people, the Alban lords, and of course, the high walls of Rome. And then the invocation. Tell me, muse, how it all began. Why was Juno outraged? Sounding, of course, very much like the Iliad and the Odyssey. What could wound the queen of the gods with all her power? Why did she force a man so famous for his devotion, this is this pious, that is to say, devotion, duty, respect, to brave such rounds of hardship, bear such trials? Can such rage inflame the immortals' hearts? Is it possible that a goddess could be this upset? The rhetorical question of all rhetorical questions, because if we've read the Iliad and the Odyssey, we already know, yeah, it is possible. Happens all the time in those poems. So here we are at the very beginning of our study. I hope that you will enjoy this study of this great poem as much as you have enjoyed the Iliad and the Odyssey. Think about this, and we've said this already in our early comments about why we study the text we study. We are the stories that we tell. We are the stories we accept. We are the stories as well that we reject. And certainly no single text plays that game more clearly than Virgil's Aeneid. He sat down to write a poem to explain to the Roman people who they were. He gave them a story that would become their story. And it became everyone's story in Europe and to the West through the time that followed. So, for example, we will have a continuation of this idea as we study early American thought, for example. Why are so many of the buildings in Washington, D.C. made to look like Roman buildings? Well, Virgil will have an answer to that through the Aeneid. So all of our reading of the earlier texts, the Iliad and the Odyssey, bring us now to our study. And hopefully we will be able to read Virgil with an increased understanding now that we've worked with the Iliad and the Odyssey. We turn now to Book 1 and to that ancient city, Carthage. It's not Rome we're talking about, the ancient city, it's Carthage. And of course, that relationship between, in history, Rome and Carthage is a really, really bad one. After they destroyed Carthage, the Romans put salt in the dirt so nothing could grow there, but something did grow there. And of course, it was the great city of Alexandria. And of course, in that great city of Alexandria, the great Christian father of all Christian fathers, St. Augustine, will be educated. And he will write later in his Confessions how important the Aeneid was for him. And of course, then later, Dante will pick up the storyline and we will have Dante's Divine Comedy, and especially the Inferno, played directly. Who is it that leads Dante through Inferno? It will be the great poet, Virgil. So, let's turn now to Carthage, let's turn to Book 1, and of course, some will argue, the greatest love story of them all, Aeneas and Dido. I hope you're ready for this conversation. Thank you.